Hello, welcome to the ninth episode of the Barebones for the Practical PM series. In this series, we pick up concepts that are important to product managers, cut through the fluff, and get to the essence of it. Today, we are going to be talking about something that has annoyingly sometimes become synonymous with product management, or at least product management interview preparation in certain quarters. We are going to talk about frameworks. But before going into frameworks, time has come for me to start telling you about my upcoming book called So You Want to Be a Product Manager? Keep an eye out on my videos, Telegram channel, LinkedIn, or whatever else you find is easier to follow for the launch announcements. Now, coming back to frameworks. The discussion around frameworks makes me sad sometimes because frameworks are a wonderful thing, really, but they are so often misused or overused that they may be on their way to becoming a joke if they haven't already. So, what is a good use of framework? There are two good uses actually. One, they can aid in structured thinking, which is the most important skill and work a product manager has. Two, they can aid in communication by making it structured and providing everybody a common language so that they can talk to each other easily without any confusions. For example, I was once in a conversation about a new product initiative with the CEO of the company and a product manager reporting to me. After some initial brainstorming, we decided that the immediate measure of success for the product will not be the revenue but the user stickiness. People should come back to this product every day. But despite having that clear problem statement, further discussions were going all over. Everyone was coming up with a few ideas and promoting or criticizing them in a haphazard fashion. At this point of time, I figured that using the hooked framework will be a good thing because that's a framework that helps you conceptualize a habit forming product. And that helped in firstly, me becoming clear of my own thoughts. It structured my thinking, like figuring out which steps of the habit forming cycle we had clear, strong ideas about and which parts we did not. And it also helped in communication within the team. Everybody also started talking in terms of those, and the next meeting was so much more fruitful than everything else combined before that. But remember this is the only time in my career I have used hooked framework because that was the only time I was working on a problem that fitted so well with it. We were talking of a new product which we wanted to become a habit forming product. The problem statement we had matched with what the framework was supposed to be about, and it helped us break down the problem in a way that made sense. On the other hand, I often see product assignments being handed over stuffed with a gazillion frameworks with no clarity on why any of them have been used. Some people do user segmentation on every assignment, and then whatever solutions they come up with has nothing to do with the segmentation at all. There is nothing they have said which couldn't have been said without user segmentation. That's just random stuffing of frameworks. Another time, there was an assignment question which required candidates to figure out how to price a particular product. Candidates were encouraged to ask questions and clarifications. One of the questions I received was, which of the problems from AARRR is it trying to solve? Folks, there are times when there is such a thing as a stupid question. AARRR framework is about product-led growth for companies. Every product problem is not going to fit into AARRR framework. Pricing one product is definitely not going to solve by this framework. But even if I'm wrong about that, I may be. Remember this. Frameworks are a way to model real world problems. Real world problems are not going to come packaged in neat framework parts. If a framework has to be used and which part of it has to be used is your job to figure out. You were given a pricing problem, not a framework problem. Picking up a random framework and asking someone else to fit the problem into it is bonkers. And that is the most important thing to understand about frameworks. Before starting to use frameworks, you have to be clear about this. What is it that you are trying to think and communicate about? Then figure out if there is a framework that can be useful. Only then should you use it. You may not need a framework for structured thinking, and that is fine so long as you do manage to think about it in a structured fashion. You do manage to break down the problem and solve the problem, and also communicate about it. So, remember some ground rules about frameworks. 1. Frameworks are an aid in thinking. Frameworks are not a substitute for thinking. Number 2. Frameworks are there to help you. You are not a slave to frameworks. Number 3. There is no universal product management framework. Do not fall for clickbaity headlines on internet. Number 4. Frameworks are not synonymous with structured thinking. You can use your own structure. You don't have to use a framework for everything. Number 5. Framework, when used, has to be suitable. Just because a cool, fancy, well-known framework exists, it doesn't mean it has to be used in your problem statement. If it's not suitable, throw it out. And number 6, more is not better in frameworks. Referring to the previous point, suitability trumps all. No good product manager keeps playing around with frameworks all day. If you need to, rewatch these ground rules, but I beg you, do not blindly use frameworks without keeping these in mind. With that, now I will move to take examples of some frameworks and when can they be used or misused. Let's start with AARRR since I went so ballistic on it earlier. AARRR, also called Pilot Matrix Framework, stands for A. Acquisition, A. Activation, R. Retention, R. Referral, and R. Revenue. From what I can find on the internet, the aim of the creator was to have startup founders focus on the right metrics for the growth instead of getting sidetracked by metrics that really didn't matter, like say social media followers. Once you are clear on that, the exact framework you use to ensure that doesn't even matter. Does the Pilot Matrix framework work for you? Sure, go ahead and use that to define your product matrix. But there would be cases where just blindly trying to fit your user journey into this will not work. For example, you may be in a business where referral is not such a big driver of growth. So trying to put in efforts into that at the same level as acquisition or retention would be a distraction instead of help. You may want to take that completely out of picture, or you may want to modify how you treat referral depending on the importance it holds for you. For example, I often find it better to incorporate referral into acquisition and treat it as an acquisition channel. Then you might have a situation where user to revenue mapping is not so straightforward. Yours may be a product that generates engagements from one set of users but revenue from others. All your social media, for example. Consumers are the ones whose engagement matter, but revenue comes from advertisers. You may want to think about those two users separately while being aware that they are connected. For example, user engagement is an offering to the advertisers in this case, something to be used in advertiser acquisition and retention. If you really think through it, I'm sure you can come up with myriads of situations where you do need to think about product growth, but blind application of the Pilot Matrix may not be the way to go. You may want to modify it, or you may want to start with something totally different as well. Then let's take example of hooked framework, which you may be thinking of as a good guy because I did use it successfully once. But again, remember, there is a certain context in which it is useful. We were talking about a habit forming product, and hooked framework, if you know about it, talks about a specific way certain product can become a habit. You have to figure out trigger, action, variable reward, and investment, leading to reloading of trigger. Basically, the idea is that a user is triggered to go to the product and take an action that the company desires them to take. They get a reward for their action, but the reward is variable, not predictable. Their actions and rewards also lead to an investment in the product that is not transferable, and it also reloads the trigger to come back to the product, so that you don't need to trigger them externally again and again to use the product. The uses of product itself leads to the next trigger to come back to it, and hence the product is a habit forming product. I have not gotten into all the nitty-gritties of the framework. You can search for hooked framework and find many articles explaining it pretty well, or even read the book. But this much is enough to talk about what I really want to emphasize, that when it is a suitable framework and when not. It was good for my case that I described earlier, but if there is a utilitarian product that people have to use for doing other mandatory tasks, hooked framework doesn't have much to offer. If yours is a product for marking employee attendance, then them not getting paid unless they mark attendance is enough of a motivation for using the product every day. Unless there is something else going on which makes it useful, hooked with its triggers and variable rewards and whatnots is wasted here. Also, if you're directly incentivizing actions every time with monetary benefits, that's not much of a use of hooked framework. Even if that monetary incentive is variable, it's just plain old incentivization. It is important that action and variable rewards result in an investment in the product and reloading of the trigger so that the next trigger is not another monetary incentivization. For example, I go to Facebook, add few friends and make a post. My friends comment on it and like it. Now I have invested time in adding friends and making a post. Likes and comments are my rewards. These rewards are reloading the trigger, so I go to Facebook to check the number of likes and comments. And encouraged by that, make another post which adds to the investment and of course uses of the product. Hooked model at its peak and probably the inspiration behind the hooked model as well. As opposed to that, consider my Amazon Prime credit card. The handsome cashbacks make me go back to Amazon for more purchases, sure, but it is a direct cash incentive. If with ongoing promotions an item, especially an expensive one, will turn out to be cheaper on Flipkart, I will go there. Cashbacks can make me a repeat user of Amazon, and repeat users may make Amazon more familiar to me, and I might not check out competition for small purchases. But it isn't quite Facebook-like habit forming. Things are transferable. It is not hooked model habit forming. So not every regular usage case is a hooked framework case. That will not help. The pilot matrix or the hooked model are the frameworks I find useful for problem breakdown with the right kinds of problems, of course. Different frameworks are meant to help in thinking through other kinds of tasks like defining the problem or prioritizing specific problems and solutions. A well-known framework for prioritization is RISE framework, which asks you to everything being considered on 4 parameters: reach, impact, confidence and effort. You can read up the details online, but the idea is that you want to implement stuff that's high on reach, impact and confidence and low on effort. So you assign scores and combine them using a formula and then implement the ones with the highest score first. Now I want to issue a word of caution while using frameworks with exact scores and formula. The concept is right in the sense that while prioritizing, you have to consider the trade-off between multiple factors. But in practice, scoring and combining those scores in a formula is too blind a way to use them. It's fine if you're stuck in a bureaucratic environment where having a supposedly objective justification for your actions are more important than actual outcomes. But if you're in an environment where real product management is done, then you will use this as a guidance and consider all factors in prioritization, but ultimately it will be a subjective judgment. An informed subjective judgment, not just a wild one, but a subjective judgment nonetheless. Scoring and putting in a formula will not help you make it objective because guess what? The scores are subjective and usually wild guess estimates. So you can use a framework for sure. It helps you structure your thinking when you consider reach, impact, confidence and effort. But don't make it a substitute for thinking in product sense. Also, do not even ever forget that before you pick up even a well-known framework like RISE, you have to determine if that's the right framework for prioritization in your case. It need not be. It may be too simple or too complex or simply unsuitable for your purpose. A very good example will be if you're trying to come up with an MVP and trying to decide what features to prioritize for an MVP. You don't have existing users, you may not even be trying to optimize for reach and impact. RISE framework may be very inappropriate here. I will leave it as an exercise for you to find out if there is a framework you would like to use for prioritizing MVP features, and if so, which one. If it depends on the product, then what kind of product would you use a particular framework for versus not. Another important point about frameworks. Frameworks don't have to exist beforehand. You can create your own framework for thinking and communicating if it helps. If you are seeing this video, I am assuming that you have seen my earlier videos, especially of the Practical PM series, where I talk about structured problem solving. And every time in a structured problem solving, you define a problem, every time you break down a problem, every time you figure out a solution, and every time you prioritize your problems and solutions, you are essentially creating a framework. Some of them may be very specific to your problem statement, so you may not think of them as frameworks, and others may be more generalizable. But the point is that frameworks are not God given and not set in stone. The ultimate holy grail is structured thinking, and existing frameworks can help in that, but so can whatever you create on your own. Finally, the way you learn about frameworks is that this is a framework and this is how it can be used. But the way you use a framework is that this is what I'm thinking about. A framework may help me in this. A framework exists that is suitable for it. Or, nope, I don't need an existing framework for this. I can do the breakdown on my own in this context and that will be better. Or, there is a framework but I should tweak it to better suit my context. You get the idea. To drive this point home and to enable you to think through the suitability of frameworks, whenever I discussed a framework in this episode, I didn't only talk about where it can be used, but also about where it cannot be used, probably more about that. It will be a good mental exercise to do every time you learn about a new framework. Then, when time comes, you will be in a better position to pick and use framework or not use them. That's it for this episode. Hope it was useful. Do tune in for upcoming episodes too, and do not forget to look out for my book that is coming soon, titled So You Want to Be a Product Manager?